channel. If you enjoy falling to sleep, listening to mysteries from the past, then we would encourage you to subscribe to our channel. We thank you for listening tonight. Now let's get into the story. The story you are about to hear is based on real historical events, real people, and documented mysteries surrounding Portlock, Alaska. While the major events, locations, and historical figures are authentic, portions of the dialogue, thoughts, and scene descriptions have been dramatized to create a cinematic retelling. Where history falls silent, imagination fills only the spaces between the facts. My name is Thomas Mercer, and in the spring of 1946, I went to work in a place called Portlock. I was 24 years old, and if you had asked me then whether I believed there were things in this world that couldn't be explained, I'd have laughed at you. I don't laugh anymore. I'd heard about Portlock from a man named Walter Briggs. Walter and I had worked together the previous winter, and one afternoon he told me about a cannery down on the Kenai Peninsula that was looking for men. The pay was good, better than good, actually, and after the war, there were plenty of young men like me looking for a place to start over. Walter said Portlock was remote. He didn't say how remote. There were no roads leading there, no highway, no train. You arrived by boat, or you didn't arrive at all. That should have bothered me. It didn't. When you're 24 years old, isolation sounds a lot like freedom. I still remember the first time I saw Portlock. It was raining. Not the kind of rain that comes down hard and announces itself. This was different. A cold mist hung over everything. The mountains, the water, the trees. It seemed less like rain falling from the sky, and more like the whole world had simply become wet. Our boat moved slowly through Port Chatham. The water was dark, almost black. Mountains rose steeply on either side of us, their upper slopes disappearing into clouds, and beneath them, the forest. I'd seen forests before, but I'd never seen anything quite like that. Those trees didn't seem to end. Spruce and hemlock packed together so tightly that from the water they looked almost like a wall. Dark, ancient, untouched. Walter stood beside me near the bow. He pointed through the mist. There. At first, I couldn't see anything. Then the buildings appeared. Portlock. It wasn't much. A collection of wooden structures pressed between the shoreline and the forest. The cannery dominated everything. Long, weathered buildings. A dock extending into the water. Storage sheds. Bunkhouses. A handful of homes. Smoke drifted from several chimneys. Men moved along the dock, preparing for the season. Somewhere, a hammer struck wood. Again, again, again. After hours surrounded by nothing but mountains and wilderness, the sound was strangely comforting. People, work, civilization. I remember thinking, this isn't so bad. The boat bumped against the dock. A heavy-set man in suspenders caught the line and wrapped it around a piling. New boys? Walter nodded. The man looked at us, then at our bags, then back at us. Hope you brought rain gear. Walter smiled. I've worked Alaska before. The man looked at me. You? First time. He laughed. Not cruelly, more like I'd said something he'd heard many times before. Give it a week. His name was Charlie Dugan. Charlie had worked at Portlock longer than almost anyone. He was probably somewhere in his 50s, although years of cold weather and hard work made him look older. His beard was mostly gray. 2 fingers were missing from his left hand. I never asked how. Charlie carried one of my bags toward the bunkhouse. As we walked, I noticed something. A rifle leaned beside the cannery door, then another near one of the sheds, and another inside the bunkhouse. I didn't think much about it. This was Alaska. There were bears. At least, that's what I assumed they were for. The bunkhouse smelled like wet wool, wood smoke, and men who had spent too much time working without bathing. There were 12 bunks, 6 on either side. Walter threw his bag onto one near the stove. I chose the one above him. "Home, sweet home," he said. I looked around. "I've lived in worse. Give it a week." I laughed. Apparently, that was something people said in Portlock. The first few days were exactly what I'd expected. Hard work, long hours, cold mornings, rain, always rain. The cannery was preparing for the salmon season, and there was more work than men to do it. We repaired equipment, replaced boards on the dock, moved barrels, unloaded supplies. By the end of each day, my shoulders ached so badly that I could barely lift my arms. I slept like the dead. And despite everything I've told you, I liked Portlock. I really did. There was something peaceful about it. The world beyond those mountains seemed very far away. No traffic, no crowds. No newspapers shouting about whatever terrible thing had happened somewhere else. Just work, meals, cards in the bunkhouse, coffee that could strip paint, and rain tapping against the roof while you fell asleep. At night, Portlock became another place. During the day, the cannery filled the settlement with noise. Machines, voices, boats, hammers. But after dark, everything stopped. And when it stopped, you became aware of just how alone you were. The ocean moved against the shore. Wind passed through the trees. Occasionally, a branch snapped somewhere in the forest. And sometimes, you heard things you couldn't identify. The first time it happened, I was lying in my bunk. Walter was already asleep beneath me. Someone across the room was snoring. The stove had nearly burned itself out. I heard something outside. 3 knocks. Slow, heavy. Wood against wood. I opened my eyes. Nothing. Then 3 more. Knock. 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 I sat up. Across the room, Charlie was awake. I could see him looking toward the window. "What is that?" I whispered. Charlie didn't answer. The sound stopped. After a while, he rolled over. Tree. I waited. A tree? Wind moves 'em. There wasn't much wind that night, but I didn't say anything. I lay back down. Within 10 minutes, I was asleep. About a week after we arrived, I met Joseph. I won't give you his last name. There are reasons for that. Joseph wasn't employed by the cannery. He occasionally brought fish, furs, or supplies through Portlock. He was an older native man who knew the coastline and mountains better than anyone I'd ever meet. Charlie trusted him. That alone told me something. Charlie didn't trust many people. One afternoon, Joseph came down the dock carrying 2 bundles wrapped in canvas. I helped him unload them. He studied me for a moment. New? That obvious? He smiled. Your boots. I looked down. What about them? They're clean. I laughed. He didn't. Later that afternoon, I found Joseph standing behind the bunkhouse. He wasn't looking toward the water. He was looking toward the trees. I walked beside him. See something? No. But he kept looking. After a moment, he asked me a strange question. You go into the woods yet? Not really. Good. I waited for him to explain. He didn't. Why? Joseph looked at me. If you go, don't go alone. I smiled. Bears? He turned back toward the forest. Bears are easy. I remember those words. I've remembered them for 80 years. Bears are easy. At the time, I thought he was joking. Portlock had stories. Every isolated place does. Men told them at night when the cards were finished and the whiskey had made its rounds. Stories about boats disappearing, hunters who never came home, strange lights over the mountains, men hearing their names called from the forest when nobody else was around. Most of it was nonsense. At least, that's what I thought. One night, Walter told me about a fisherman who supposedly disappeared several years earlier. They found him upriver, Walter said. Dead? Walter nodded. How? He shrugged. Don't know. Charlie was sitting near the stove. He stopped sharpening his knife. Walter looked at him. You know the story. Charlie kept his eyes on the blade. I know people talk too much. Walter grinned. Come on, Charlie. Charlie stopped sharpening. The room became quiet. He looked around at us. Then he said something I'll never forget. There's stories you tell because they're entertaining. He looked toward the window. And there's stories you don't tell because they're true. Nobody laughed. Charlie returned to sharpening his knife. That was the end of the conversation. A few days later, I finally went into the forest. Walter needed help checking a storage shed about half a mile inland. The trail began behind the cannery. Within 50 yards, Portlock disappeared. I don't mean we couldn't see the buildings. I mean, it disappeared. The sounds vanished. No machinery. No voices. No waves against the dock. Nothing. Only trees. The forest floor was thick with moss. Everything was green. Not bright green. Dark green. Wet green. Moss covered fallen logs. Moss climbed the trunks. Even the rocks seemed alive. The canopy above us was so thick that although it was midday, it felt like evening. Walter walked ahead. I followed. After perhaps 10 minutes, I noticed something. "Walter." He stopped. "You hear that?" He listened. "Hear what?" "Exactly. No birds, no insects, no wind, nothing." The forest had become completely silent. Walter looked around, then smiled. "You're letting Charlie's stories get to you. Charlie didn't tell us anything." "Exactly." He started walking again. I followed, but I couldn't shake the feeling. We reached the shed, checked the supplies. Nothing unusual. On the way back, we found the tracks. Walter saw them first. He stopped so suddenly I nearly walked into him. "What?" He pointed toward the mud. There were impressions beside the trail. Large ones. I crouched. "Barefoot?" Walter didn't answer. "That's what they looked like. Human footprints. Except too large. Much too large. The ground was soft, so the edges weren't clear. There were only 3 impressions before they disappeared into moss. I put my boot beside one. My boot looked small. "Bear?" I asked. Walter stared at them. "Probably. You ever seen a bear track shaped like that?" "No." Neither had I. We stood there longer than we should have. Then Walter said, "Let's go." We didn't mention the tracks when we returned. I don't know why. Maybe because we knew what everyone would say. Mud distorts tracks. Bears step strangely. People see what they want to see. There was an explanation. There always is. That evening, Joseph was still in Portlock. I found him near his boat. "Can I ask you something?" He looked at me. "What?" I described the tracks. I expected him to laugh. He didn't. He asked where we'd found them. I told him. His expression changed, just slightly. "You go back there?" "Not planning on it." "Good." There was that word again. Good. I waited. "Joseph, what made those tracks?" He pulled a rope tight around one of his bundles. Then he looked toward the forest. For several seconds, he said nothing. Finally, he spoke. "There are things in these mountains that were here before Portlock." I smiled nervously. "What things?" Joseph looked at me. "Old things." Then he climbed into his boat. I watched him leave. His small boat moved slowly across Port Chatham until the mist swallowed it. Behind me, the cannery whistle sounded. Men began walking toward the bunkhouse. Dinner. Normal life. I remember turning toward the buildings. Then, for some reason, I looked back at the forest. At first, I saw nothing. Then, something moved. Far back among the trees, too far away to identify. Tall, dark. It passed between 2 trunks and disappeared. I stood there, waiting for it to appear again. It never did. That night, I heard the knocking again. 3 times. Knock. 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 Then silence. I looked across the bunkhouse. Charlie was awake. This time, he wasn't looking at the window. He was looking at the rifle beside his bed. I didn't know it then, but within a few months, one of the men sleeping in that bunkhouse would disappear, and when we went looking for him, we would find something in those woods that would change Portlock forever, something that finally made me understand what Joseph meant. Bears were easy. Chapter 2. The First Man. His name was Samuel Reed. Sam. He was 31 years old. From Oregon, I think. Maybe Washington. It's strange, the things you forget. I can remember exactly how his boots sounded walking across the bunkhouse floor. I can remember the tobacco he smoked. I can remember the little scar above his left eyebrow. But I can't remember where he was born. That's what 80 years does to a memory. It takes pieces, leaves others. But I remember the morning Sam Reed disappeared. It was June. The salmon hadn't arrived in force yet, but the days had become longer. In that part of Alaska, summer doesn't behave the way it does farther south. Darkness never quite settles properly. Even late at night, there can be a gray light hanging over the mountains. That morning was overcast, cold, wet, normal for Portlock. I woke to Charlie kicking the side of my bunk. "Mercer." I opened my eyes. "What?" "Get up." Something in his voice woke me faster than coffee ever could. Walter was already dressing. Across the room, Sam's bunk was empty. I climbed down. "What's wrong?" Charlie picked up his coat. Reed didn't come back. Sam had left the previous afternoon. There was an old equipment shed inland that we'd been using to store tools. Nothing important. Axes, rope, lantern fuel, spare parts. One of the men had left a crate there earlier in the week, and Sam volunteered to retrieve it. The shed was perhaps 3/4 of a mile from Portlock. Maybe a little more. It wasn't far. He left around 3. He should have been back before supper. When he wasn't, nobody worried. Sam liked being alone. Sometimes he'd walk down the shoreline after work. Sometimes he'd disappear with a fishing rod for hours. By 9 o'clock, Walter noticed. By 10, Charlie was concerned. By midnight, 2 men had walked partway up the trail, calling his name. They found nothing. Charlie wouldn't let them go farther in the dark. At first light, we organized a search. There were 7 of us. Charlie, Walter, me, a man named Frank Ellis, 2 cannery workers whose names I no longer remember, and Mr. Harlan, the cannery foreman. Every man carried a rifle. I noticed that immediately. Harlan tried to make light of it. Bears are moving this time of year. Nobody answered. Charlie handed me a Winchester. "You know how to use one?" "Yes." "Keep a round chambered." I looked at him. "For bears?" Charlie met my eyes, then walked away. We entered the forest shortly after 6. The trail was muddy from several days of rain. That helped us at first. Sam's boot prints were easy to follow. He'd walked directly toward the equipment shed. No wandering, no strange detours. Just one man walking a familiar trail. We reached the place where Walter and I had seen the large tracks weeks earlier. I looked toward the patch of mud. The rain had erased everything. Still, I remember walking a little faster after that. We reached the shed. The door was open. Charlie raised one hand. Everyone stopped. "Sam?" Nothing. Charlie approached. The rest of us followed. Inside, Everything looked normal. Crates, tools, rope, an old lantern. And sitting near the door was the crate Sam had been sent to retrieve. Walter stared at it. "He made it here." Charlie nodded. "Looks like it." "Then where'd he go?" Nobody knew. We searched around the building. Behind the shed, Frank found Sam's tracks. They continued away from Portlock, deeper into the forest. Harlan swore. Why the hell would he go that way? Charlie crouched beside the prints. Sam had walked perhaps 20 yards, then stopped. The mud showed several overlapping impressions, almost as though he'd stood in one place, turning around, looking. Then the tracks continued. But his stride had changed. Longer, faster. Walter noticed it too. He was running. Charlie didn't answer. We followed. The trail disappeared completely now. We were moving through untouched forest. Branches grabbed at our clothing. Moss swallowed our footsteps. Every few minutes, we lost Sam's trail. Then someone would find a broken fern, a disturbed patch of mud, a snapped branch. Something. Enough to keep us moving. After perhaps half an hour, we found his hat. It was lying beside a fallen tree. Charlie picked it up. There was mud on one side, nothing else. Walter called into the trees. "Sam!" His voice traveled through the forest, then disappeared. "Sam Reed!" Nothing. We kept going. I began noticing something. The farther we traveled, the quieter the forest became. At first, there had been birds, water dripping from branches, wind high in the trees. Then, little by little, those sounds disappeared. Eventually, there was only us. 7 men breathing. 7 pairs of boots pushing through wet ground. 7 rifles carried a little higher than before. "Dita," Frank stopped. "Charlie." We gathered around him. There was a tree ahead of us. The bark had been damaged, not scratched, damaged. A section, perhaps 6 feet above the ground, had been stripped away. Long marks ran down the trunk. Harlan stepped closer. "Bear." Charlie looked at the marks. "Could be." Frank touched one. "That's high. Big bear." Nobody sounded convinced. "Dita," we continued. 10 minutes later, we found Sam's rifle. That frightened me more than anything we'd found so far. It was lying on the ground beside a cluster of rocks. Charlie picked it up. The rifle was loaded. Sam hadn't fired it. Walter looked around. "He wouldn't leave that." "No," Charlie said. "He wouldn't." "Dita, something had happened here. You could feel it." Sam's footprints were scattered. Some pointed one direction, some another. The ground was torn up, not violently, but enough to show movement, confusion. Then the tracks disappeared. Charlie searched one side. Frank searched the other. I walked toward a shallow creek. That's where I found the second set. "Dita." At first, I thought they were Sam's. Then I saw the size. I didn't say anything. I just stared. 3 impressions, pressed deeply into the mud. Long, broad, almost human. Almost. I placed my boot beside one, just as I had weeks earlier. The print extended several inches beyond my toe. Walter came up behind me. For once, he didn't joke. "Same as before?" I nodded. Charlie walked over. He looked down. His face changed. Not surprise. Recognition. That's what bothered me. Charlie had seen something like them before. I knew it. "Bear?" Harlan asked. Charlie stood. "Probably." Frank laughed once. There was no humor in it. "That's no bear." Harlan turned toward him. You an expert now? I know what a bear track looks like. So do I. Then tell me that's a bear. Harlan didn't. Dita, we followed the creek. Sam's tracks never reappeared. The large tracks did. Once, on the opposite bank. One impression in soft mud. Then nothing. Whatever had made it had crossed the creek. Charlie stared toward the trees. We're going back. Walter looked at him. What? We need more men. Sam's out here. I know. So we're leaving him? Charlie turned. I said we're going back. There was something in his voice. Nobody argued. Dita, halfway to Portlock, we heard the whistle. Not the cannery whistle. A human whistle. One sharp note. From somewhere behind us. Every man stopped. Walter looked back. Sam? Charlie raised his rifle. Sam! Nothing. Then, another whistle. Farther to our left. Frank whispered, What the hell? Harlan cupped his hands around his mouth. Read! Silence. Then, from somewhere ahead of us, another whistle. That wasn't possible. Not unless someone had moved through the forest faster than we had. Charlie lowered his voice. Nobody answers it. Harlan looked at him. What? You heard me. If that's Sam, it isn't. I remember the way Charlie said those words. No hesitation. No uncertainty. It isn't. Dita, we started walking again. Faster. Nobody spoke. The forest felt different now. I know how that sounds. A forest is a forest. Trees don't change because you're frightened. But that afternoon, I swear those trees felt closer together. Every dark space between them looked occupied. Every branch snapping behind us sounded deliberate. Dita, then something followed us. Not close, never close. But something moved when we moved. We would walk. It would walk. We would stop. It would stop. At first, I thought I imagined it. Then Walter leaned toward me. You hear that? I nodded. Charlie heard us. Keep moving. The sound came from our right. Heavy steps. Slow. Parallel to us. We couldn't see anything through the trees. Frank raised his rifle. Charlie grabbed the barrel and pushed it down. Don't. There's something there. I know. That was the second time Charlie said something that frightened me more than the sound itself. Dita, we walked. The footsteps continued, then stopped. We kept going. For maybe 5 minutes, nothing. Then, behind us, a branch broke. Not a twig, a branch. Thick enough that the crack echoed through the trees. Nobody turned around. Dita, when we finally saw the buildings of Portlock, I nearly laughed from relief. The forest released us all at once. Noise returned. Men working. Water against the dock. The cannery engine. Someone shouting from a boat. Ordinary sounds. Beautiful sounds. Charlie waited until every man was clear of the trees. Then he turned and looked back. I stood beside him. Charlie. He didn't move. What was following us? He stared into the forest. I don't know. That was a lie. Dita. We returned with 14 men that afternoon. Joseph had arrived while we were gone. When he heard Sam was missing, he didn't ask what happened. He asked, where? Charlie told him. Joseph's face hardened. You found tracks? Nobody had mentioned the tracks. Harlan looked at him. What makes you ask that? Joseph ignored him. He looked at Charlie. Charlie nodded. Joseph closed his eyes. Just for a second. Then he said, we find him before dark. The second search moved differently. Nobody joked. Nobody wandered. Joseph led us. He moved through the forest without hesitation. Places where we'd struggled to find Sam's trail, Joseph found signs almost immediately. A bent branch, a footprint barely visible in moss, a stone turned over. Things I would never have noticed. We reached the place where we'd found Sam's rifle. Joseph examined the ground. Then he walked toward the creek. He found the large print. He crouched beside it. For a long time, he said nothing. Harlan stood over him. "Bear?" Joseph looked up. No. Nobody spoke. Finally, someone had said it. Harlan folded his arms. "Then what?" Joseph stood. "We find Sam." "That's not what I asked." "I know." And he walked away. We searched until evening. Nothing. No clothing, no blood, no more tracks. Sam Reed had simply vanished. As the light began fading, Joseph insisted we return. Harlan protested. "We have lanterns." Joseph shook his head. "We don't stay here after dark." "Why?" Joseph looked around at the trees. "Because it knows we're looking." I felt cold, and not because of the weather. On the walk back, nobody heard whistles. Nobody heard footsteps. Nothing followed us. Somehow, that was worse. For the next 3 days, we searched. Boats searched the shoreline. Men followed creeks. Hunters checked trails. We searched places miles from where Sam had disappeared. Nothing. On the 4th day, we found his pack. It was almost 2 miles from where we'd found the rifle. Uphill, deep in country none of us believed Sam would have entered alone. The pack was hanging from a tree branch, not sitting beneath it, hanging about 9 feet above the ground. Frank stared upward. "How'd he get that up there?" Nobody answered. Charlie used a long branch to knock it down. Inside, everything was still there. Food, matches, a small knife, a notebook. Nothing had been taken, except Sam. That night, the bunkhouse was quiet. Nobody played cards. Nobody drank. Sam's empty bunk seemed larger than it should have. His blanket was still folded at the foot. His coffee cup sat on a shelf. Little pieces of a man, waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. Around 9, Joseph entered. Charlie closed the door behind him. Joseph stood near the stove. For a while, he said nothing. Then Harlan asked the question we'd all been thinking. What made those tracks? Joseph looked at each of us. When his eyes reached me, he stopped. "You saw them before." It wasn't a question. I nodded. "Few weeks ago." "Same place?" "Close." Joseph looked at Charlie. Charlie swore quietly. "You should have told me." I looked at him. "Why?" Nobody answered. I felt anger replacing fear. Everybody keeps acting like they know something. Charlie stared at the floor. Joseph remained silent. I continued. "Sam is missing. Something followed us through those woods. We found tracks that don't belong to any animal I've ever seen, and his pack was hanging 9 feet up a tree." I looked around the room. "So somebody tell me what the hell is going on." Joseph pulled a chair toward the stove. He sat. The fire cracked behind him. Rain tapped against the windows. Finally, he spoke. "People lived around these waters long before your cannery. Nobody moved. Long before Portlock." He looked toward the dark window. "They knew these mountains. They knew what lived in them." Walter leaned forward. "What lived in them?" Joseph didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. "There are stories." Charlie looked uncomfortable. Joseph continued, "Stories about something that walks like a man, but isn't one." Nobody laughed. Outside, something struck the wall. Once. Everyone turned. Then again. Knock. Joseph stood. Charlie reached for his rifle. Then came the third. Knock. Nobody moved. Joseph stared at the wall. I looked at him. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked afraid. Then, from somewhere beyond the bunkhouse, out past the last buildings, at the edge of the forest, came a whistle. One sharp note. Walter whispered, "Sam?" Joseph turned toward him. No. Another whistle came from the darkness. Closer. Joseph reached for the lantern, and before anyone could ask him another question, he finally gave the thing in those mountains a name. Nantiinaq. The Spaces Between the Facts. Portlock. Chapter 3. Nantiinaq. Nantiinaq. I had never heard the word before. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Rain tapped against the bunkhouse roof. The stove crackled. And somewhere outside, beyond the thin wooden walls, the whistle came again. One sharp note. Joseph extinguished the lantern. The room went dark. "What are you doing?" Walter whispered. "Quiet." Charlie moved toward the window. Joseph grabbed his arm. "Don't." Charlie stopped. "Why?" Joseph lowered his voice. "Don't let it see you looking." That sentence stayed with me. Don't let it see you looking. We waited. 5 minutes, maybe 10. Nobody moved. Then, from the far side of the bunkhouse, came a sound. Crunch. 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 Something was walking through the wet gravel. Slowly, one step at a time. It reached the corner of the building and stopped. Walter was standing beside me. I could hear him breathing. The footsteps began again. They moved along the wall. Crunch. 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 Then stopped directly beneath the window. I don't know how long we stood there. 30 seconds can feel like an hour when you're waiting for something to happen. Then we heard it. Breathing. Deep. Slow. Not loud, but close enough that there was no mistaking it. Something was standing on the other side of that wall. Frank reached for the rifle beside his bunk. Joseph shook his head. Frank froze. The breathing continued. Then the window moved. Not much, just enough. A faint scrape against the frame. Someone or something had touched the glass. Walter whispered something under his breath, probably a prayer. Then the footsteps continued, past the window, around the building, and toward the forest. We listened until we couldn't hear them anymore. Joseph waited another 5 minutes before relighting the lantern. Nobody immediately spoke. Finally, Harlan broke the silence. "Bear." Charlie looked at him. "That bear whistle too?" Harlan didn't answer. Joseph returned to his chair. I sat across from him. "What is Nantiinaq?" Joseph rubbed his hands together. For a moment, I thought he might refuse to answer. Instead, he said, "It's a name." "For what?" "Something people here have known about a long time." Walter sat beside me. "Like Bigfoot?" Joseph frowned. "I don't know what that is." A hairy man. Ape. Something like that. Joseph shook his head. People like to make things simple. What does that mean? You want me to tell you it's an animal? He looked at me. Then you can decide what kind. Nobody spoke. Joseph continued. But I can't tell you that. I leaned forward. Have you seen one? He stared into the stove. No. That surprised me. You haven't? No. Then how do you know it's real? Joseph looked at me. Have you seen the bottom of the ocean? No. You believe it's there. That's different. Why? I didn't have an answer. Joseph told us that people living around the southern Kenai had stories about strange beings in the mountains. Large, hair-covered, walking upright, sometimes seen at great distances, usually alone. He said people occasionally found tracks. Sometimes hunters heard sounds they couldn't explain, and sometimes people disappeared. How long have people been seeing them? Walter asked. Joseph shrugged. Longer than Portlock has been here. How many? Enough. Harlan stood. This is ridiculous. Joseph looked at him. You asked. You're telling these men some campfire story while Reed is missing. No. Joseph's voice changed. I'm telling them why Reed may be missing. The room became quiet. Harlan stepped closer. You saying some giant hairy man carried him away? I didn't say that. Then what are you saying? Joseph stood. I'm saying you shouldn't have built this place here. Nobody spoke. Even Charlie looked surprised. Harlan laughed. You serious? Joseph walked toward the door. You asked what I know. He opened it. Cold air entered the room. Then he looked back. If you go into the forest, his eyes moved from one man to another. Go together. He stepped outside, then stopped. And if you hear someone calling your name, pause. Make sure you can see them before you answer. The door closed. Walter looked at me. Well, what? I liked bears better. So did I. The next morning, we found tracks behind the bunkhouse. Not many. 4 impressions in the mud. The rain had softened them, but they were large, much larger than mine. Charlie stared at them. Harlan barely looked. Bear. Nobody argued anymore. There wasn't any point. Sam Reed remained missing. After a week, the official search began shrinking. There were jobs that had to be done. Boats arriving. Equipment running. Salmon season approaching. Portlock couldn't stop because one man disappeared. That sounds cruel. Maybe it was. But isolated places have their own rules. Work continues. Weather continues. People continue. Even when someone doesn't. Sam's bunk remained empty. Nobody took it. Not even when 2 new workers arrived later that month. Charlie told them it was broken. It wasn't. For a while, nothing happened. That's something people don't understand when they hear stories like this. They imagine terror every night, footsteps outside every window, creatures screaming from the forest. It wasn't like that. Most days, Portlock was normal, completely normal. Men worked, fish came in, Boats left. People complained about food. Somebody always owed somebody money from cards. We laughed. We argued. We lived. And after a few weeks, even Sam's disappearance began becoming something we didn't talk about. Humans are good at that. We can get used to almost anything if enough ordinary days come afterward. July arrived. The salmon came with it, and Portlock became busier than I'd ever seen it. Boats arrived almost constantly. The cannery ran late into the evening. There were days when I worked 14 hours, sometimes 16. By the time I reached my bunk, I didn't care what lived in those mountains. If Nantiinaq wanted me, it was going to have to wake me up first. Then one afternoon, a fisherman named Ben Foster came into Portlock. Ben wasn't from the cannery. He worked the coastline independently and sold part of his catch to us. He was probably 40. Quiet man. Hard. The kind of person Alaska creates. He'd spent most of his adult life outdoors. Ben wasn't frightened by much. That matters, because when he stepped onto our dock that afternoon, he was frightened. Charlie noticed first. What happened? Ben tied his boat. Nothing. Charlie looked at the empty deck. Where's your gear? Ben didn't answer. What happened to your gear? Lost it. How? Ben looked toward the mountains, then at the men standing around us. I need fuel. Charlie folded his arms. You've got fuel. Then I need more. Ben finally looked at him. I ain't going back there. Everyone stopped working. Charlie lowered his voice. Back where? South Inlet. Joseph had mentioned that area. Very few people traveled inland there. Charlie knew it too. What happened? Ben shook his head. Nothing. Something happened. Ben stared at him. Then, after several seconds, he told us. He had gone ashore that morning to check a small trap line. Nothing unusual. He'd done it dozens of times. He pulled his boat above the tide line and entered the forest. About a mile inland, he smelled something. A terrible smell. Worse than dead fish, he said. He thought there might be a dead bear nearby. Then he heard something moving. Big? Walter asked. Ben looked at him. Heavy. Could have been a bear. I know bears. That sentence again. Everyone in Alaska knew bears. Bears were frightening, but bears made sense. Ben said the movement stayed ahead of him. He never saw it clearly, just branches moving, occasional footsteps. He decided to turn around. That's when something began following him. I felt the hair rise on my arms. It was exactly what had happened to us. Did it whistle? I asked. Ben looked at me. How'd you know that? Nobody answered. He said the whistle came 3 times. Once from behind him, once from his right, and once from ahead. Ben began running. He abandoned his pack. Then his rifle became tangled in brush. Instead of stopping, he left that too. When he reached the shoreline, he didn't pull his boat into the water. He shoved it hard, then waded after it until the water reached his waist. He climbed aboard, started the engine, and never looked back. Except once, about 50 yards offshore. He looked toward the trees. "What'd you see?" Charlie asked. Ben stared at the dock. For a long time, he didn't answer. Finally, he said, "A man." Walter frowned. "A man?" Ben nodded. "Standing where I'd left the boat." "What man?" Ben looked at him. "Biggest man I ever saw." Nobody said anything. Ben continued, "Covered in hair." Harlan walked away. He didn't want to hear it. Ben watched him leave, then looked at us. "It didn't chase the boat." "What did it do?" I asked. Ben swallowed. Watched. Joseph arrived that evening. Charlie told him what Ben had seen. Joseph listened. When Charlie finished, Joseph asked only one question. "Where?" Ben told him. Joseph's face tightened. "You're lucky." Ben laughed bitterly. "Don't feel lucky. You came back." Joseph looked toward the mountains. "That makes you lucky." That night, Ben slept in our bunkhouse. His boat remained tied to the dock. He planned to leave at first light. Around midnight, I woke, not because of a sound, because Walter was shaking me. "Tom!" I opened my eyes. "What?" He held one finger to his lips, then pointed toward Ben. Ben was sitting upright in his bunk, staring at the window. "What is it?" I whispered. Ben didn't answer. Then I heard it. A whistle, far away, from the forest. Ben closed his eyes. No. Another whistle, closer. Charlie sat up. Then another man. Then another. Soon, almost everyone was awake. The whistle came again, closer. Ben whispered. It followed me. Joseph's warning returned to me. If you hear someone calling your name, make sure you can see them before you answer. Then, from the forest, someone called, "Ben." Every man in that bunkhouse froze. It was a man's voice, distant, rough, but unmistakable. "Ben." Ben began shaking his head. No. Again. Closer. "Ben." Walter looked at me. I could see fear in his face. Not because something outside knew Ben's name. There was another reason. A much worse reason. We recognized the voice. Charlie stood slowly. He reached for his rifle. Outside, the voice called again. "Ben." I knew that voice. Every man who'd worked with him knew it. It belonged to someone who couldn't possibly be standing outside. Someone we'd been searching for almost a month. Sam Reed. Ben climbed out of bed. Charlie grabbed him. "Don't. That's Sam." "No. We found him." Charlie tightened his grip. "That isn't Sam." The voice came again. Closer now. Maybe 30 yards from the building. "Ben." This time, something about it was wrong. The words stretched too long, almost like whoever was speaking had heard human speech, but didn't quite understand how it worked. Ben. Then, silence. Nobody slept. At sunrise, we went outside. The ground was wet. Mud surrounded the bunkhouse, and beneath the window where Ben had slept, we found one enormous footprint. Only one. Ben left Portlock that morning. He never returned. Years later, people would ask when Portlock began dying. They wanted a date, a moment, something they could write down. But towns don't die in a moment. They die slowly. One person leaves, then another. Someone refuses to return. Someone sells a boat. A family moves away. And eventually, there are more empty beds than occupied ones. Sam Reed's disappearance didn't kill Portlock. Ben Foster leaving didn't kill Portlock. Not yet. But something had changed. Men stopped entering the forest alone. Rifles appeared beside every door. Children were told to stay near the buildings. And after sunset, nobody walked beyond the cannery lights. We had begun drawing an invisible line around Portlock. On one side, us. On the other, the forest. And somewhere beyond that line, something had learned our names. But even then, I still wasn't convinced. I believed we'd frightened ourselves. I believed Sam had become lost. I believed Ben had seen a bear standing upright in poor light. I believed the voice outside the bunkhouse had some rational explanation. I had to, because the alternative was impossible. Then August came, and 3 of us found something beside the river that finally made believing in the impossible easier than believing anything else. A body, not Sam Reed, someone else. And whatever had happened to him had not been done by a bear. The spaces between the facts. Portlock. Chapter 4. What we found by the river. There are things a man remembers because he wants to. And there are things he remembers because he has no choice. What we found beside that river belongs to the second kind. It was August of 1946, 3 months since I'd arrived in Portlock. Long enough for the place to feel like home. Long enough for me to recognize every voice in the bunkhouse, every loose board on the dock, every sound the cannery made when the machinery started in the morning, and long enough for me to know which sounds didn't belong. Sam Reed had been missing for weeks. Ben Foster had left and never returned. Men no longer joked about the forest. Not much anyway. During daylight, we pretended everything was normal. At night, rifles remained beside the beds. Nobody admitted being afraid. We simply called it being careful. There is a difference, until there isn't. The morning we found the body began beautifully. That's another thing I remember. Sunlight. Actual sunlight. After weeks of rain and mist, the clouds had broken. The mountains surrounding Port Chatham seemed almost close enough to touch. Snow remained on the highest ridges. The water was calm. Even the forest looked different, less threatening. Green, alive, almost inviting. I remember standing outside the bunkhouse, drinking coffee, thinking how ridiculous some of our fears seemed in daylight. Darkness changes things. So does exhaustion. Maybe that's all we'd experienced. Strange tracks, missing men, whistles, voices. Put enough frightened people together, and eventually they start frightening one another. That's what I told myself. Charlie ruined that idea before breakfast. Mercer. I turned. He was standing beside Walter. Both had packs. Rifles, too. We need another man. For what? Intake line. The cannery drew fresh water from a stream farther inland. Something had reduced the flow overnight. Probably debris, branches, mud. Maybe an animal had damaged part of the line. Ordinary problem. Ordinary work. I finished my coffee. How far? Couple miles. I looked at the rifles. Charlie noticed. Bears. He said it without smiling. We left shortly after 7. The first part of the trail was familiar. Same wet earth. Same moss-covered trees. Same smell of spruce and rotting wood. But this time, the forest had sound. Birds moved through the canopy. Water dropped from branches. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker hammered against a tree. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed those sounds. Walter seemed relaxed, too. He walked ahead of me, occasionally swinging his rifle by the sling. After half an hour, he said, "Maybe Joseph scared that thing all the way to Anchorage." Charlie didn't laugh. Walter looked back. "That was a joke." "I know. You're allowed to laugh. I'll remember." We reached the creek before 9. The intake pipe followed the water upstream. Charlie inspected it every few yards. Eventually, we found the problem. A fallen tree had shifted part of the pipe. Nothing mysterious. Nothing frightening. Just a tree. I remember feeling relieved. Imagine that. Relieved to find a fallen tree. We spent perhaps an hour repairing the damage. Walter worked downstream. Charlie and I reset the pipe. The sun climbed higher. For once, I was warm enough to remove my coat. Then Walter called. "Charlie?" No answer. "Charlie." Something in his voice made me stand. Charlie heard it too. We followed the creek. Walter was about 70 yards downstream, standing still, looking toward the opposite bank. "What?" Charlie asked. Walter didn't answer. He pointed. At first, I saw clothing. Dark fabric caught between rocks. Then, a boot. Charlie moved toward the water. "Stay here." Neither of us listened. The creek wasn't deep. Maybe knee-high. cold enough to hurt. We crossed. The closer we got, the less I wanted to keep walking. There was a man lying beside the water, face down, partly hidden by brush. I didn't recognize his clothes. That relieved me for half a second. It wasn't Sam. Then I realized what that meant. There was another missing man we didn't know was missing. Charlie approached carefully. He knelt, touched the man's shoulder, then pulled his hand away. Walter whispered, "Dead?" Charlie looked at him. There was no need to answer. I won't describe the body. People have asked me to. I won't. Some things don't become more truthful because you describe them in detail. I'll tell you only what matters. The man had been badly injured. His clothing was torn, and whatever had happened violently. Walter turned away. I couldn't. Charlie studied the ground. "Bear?" I asked it quietly. He didn't answer. There were marks around the body, disturbed mud, broken vegetation, a few impressions too damaged to identify. Charlie walked several yards upstream, then stopped. I knew what he'd found before I reached him. A footprint, large, bare, human-shaped, pressed deeply into the mud. Charlie stared at it. "Don't." I looked at him. "Don't what?" "Say it." "I wasn't going to." "Good." Walter joined us. He looked at the print, then toward the body, then back again. "Charlie." "I know." "No, you don't." Charlie turned. "What?" Walter pointed toward the mud. "There." Another impression, farther away. Then another. They led from the creek toward the forest. We followed them. Only 20 yards, no farther. The last print disappeared beneath a fallen log. Charlie crouched. Something was caught on the bark. Hair. Dark. Coarse. Several strands. Walter touched it. Charlie slapped his hand away. "Leave it." "What is it?" "You know what hair looks like." "Bear?" Charlie stared at him. Walter nodded. "Right." We returned to the body. Nobody spoke for several minutes. Then, from upstream, came a sound. A rock striking another rock. Clack. We turned. Nothing. Then again. Clack. Farther away. Walter raised his rifle. "Who's there?" Charlie whispered, "Don't." Silence. Then 3 knocks, not on wood, on something hollow. Knock, knock, knock. My stomach tightened. The bunkhouse, those nights, the same rhythm. Charlie lifted his rifle. Time to go. What about him? I asked. We come back with men. We can't leave him. Charlie looked toward the trees. We're not staying. We crossed the creek. Walter kept looking behind us. I didn't. I had learned something by then. Sometimes not seeing what follows you is easier. We had walked perhaps a quarter mile when Walter stopped. Where's Charlie? I turned. He wasn't behind us. Charlie? No answer. My heart began pounding. We ran back, maybe 50 yards. Then we saw him. Charlie stood beside a tree, staring upward. I almost shouted at him. Then I saw his face. What? He pointed. High on the trunk, maybe 8 feet above the ground, were scratches. 4 long grooves. Fresh, pale wood exposed beneath the bark. Walter stepped closer. Bear. Charlie finally looked at him. Stop saying that. That was the first time Charlie admitted it. Not what he thought it was, only what it wasn't. We returned to Portlock before noon. Harlan organized 6 men. Joseph happened to be there. When Charlie told him we'd found a body, Joseph didn't react immediately. Then Charlie mentioned the tracks. Joseph looked toward the mountains. Where? Charlie told him. Joseph shook his head. We go now. 10 of us returned. The body was still there. Joseph approached alone. He knelt several feet away. For a long time, he simply looked. Then he walked to the footprint. Then the hair. Then the scratches. He never touched anything. Harlan stood behind him. Well? Joseph ignored him. Joseph. Nothing. Is this your Nantiinaq? Joseph finally turned. I don't know. Harlan laughed bitterly. Convenient. Joseph walked toward him. You think knowing a name means knowing something? Harlan didn't answer. We give names to things because we're afraid of not knowing what they are. He pointed toward the forest. Calling it Nantiinaq doesn't mean I understand it. That was the most sensible thing anyone had said, and somehow the least comforting. We carried the man back to Portlock. Nobody recognized him. He had no identification we could find. No wallet, no papers, nothing. A boatman passing through several days later thought he might have seen someone matching his description farther north. Maybe a trapper. Maybe not. His identity, at least to us, remained uncertain. That night, the body was kept in one of the storage buildings. We planned to send it out on the next boat. Nobody wanted to guard it. Nobody said why. Eventually, Harlan ordered Frank and me to take the first watch. We sat outside the shed. 2 chairs, 2 rifles, 1 lantern. The night was unusually still. Frank smoked. I watched the trees. Around 11, Frank said, "You think Joseph's right?" "About what?" "That thing." I shrugged. "You saw the tracks." "I saw tracks." "You saw the hair." "I saw hair." "You heard Sam." I looked at him. "We heard something." Frank smiled. "You really don't want to believe it?" "No." "Why?" I thought about that. Because if I believe it, then I have to believe something like that can exist. Frank took another drag. And then I have to wonder what else does. Frank nodded. Fair enough. Midnight passed. Nothing happened. 1 o'clock. Nothing. Around 2, I began getting sleepy. Then the lantern flickered. Frank looked at it. No wind. The flame steadied. Then, from inside the shed, something moved. Scrape. Frank sat upright. What was that? I raised my rifle. We waited. Nothing. Then, another scrape. Longer. Frank stood. I'm checking. Wait. It's a dead man, Tom. I know. He reached for the door, then stopped. There was another sound. Not inside. Behind the building. Breathing. Frank slowly backed away. We stared toward the corner. The lantern illuminated maybe 20 feet. Beyond that, darkness. Something stepped on gravel. Crunch. Then again. Crunch. It was moving toward us. Frank raised his rifle. I did the same. Who's there? No answer. The footsteps stopped. Then a smell reached us. Strong, rotten, wet, like an animal, and something worse. Frank covered his nose. Jesus. A shadow moved beyond the lantern light. Tall. Too tall. For 1 second, I saw the outline of something standing beside the building. Then it stepped backward. Gone. Frank fired. The rifle blast shattered the night. Men came running from the bunkhouse. Charlie first. Then Walter. Harlan. Others. What happened? Frank pointed. Something was there. Where? There. Men spread out. Lanterns appeared. Someone brought another rifle. We searched behind the shed. Nothing. Then Charlie found the print. One, deep in the mud. Joseph arrived several minutes later. He studied it, then looked at me. You saw it? I nodded. What? I don't know. How tall? I looked toward the wall. There was a beam perhaps 7 feet above the ground. The shadow had seemed higher. Big. Joseph waited. Very big. He looked toward the forest, then said something quietly. I almost didn't hear him. It's getting closer. The next morning, the body was gone. The shed door was open. The lock, broken. Not cut, broken. A heavy iron latch bent outward. Inside, the table was empty. Harlan accused Frank, then me, then everyone. Someone must have moved the body. It was the only explanation. We searched the shoreline, the buildings, the dock. Nothing. Behind the shed, we found marks in the mud. One set, large impressions, leading toward the trees. Nobody followed them, not even Harlan. That afternoon, a meeting was held inside the cannery. Almost every worker attended. Nobody officially called it a meeting about Nantiinaq. It was supposedly about safety, travel, bears, missing workers. But everyone knew why we were there. Harlan stood in front. No man goes inland alone. Nobody objected. 2-man minimum. Charlie interrupted. 4. Harlan looked at him. 4? 4 men. Joseph stood near the back. 6. Someone laughed nervously. Joseph didn't. Eventually, Harlan agreed. Nobody entered the forest without a group. Everyone carried a rifle. Nobody remained inland after sunset. Children were forbidden from going beyond the buildings, and a whistle was installed beside the cannery. 3 blasts meant everyone returned immediately. Think about that. We were grown men, fishermen, hunters, veterans, men who worked around machinery capable of tearing off an arm, men who lived among storms, bears, freezing water, and mountains. And we had begun making rules about the forest. Portlock was changing. People began leaving. Not many, not yet. A family with 2 children went first. They said they wanted better schooling. Maybe they did. Then another man quit, said the pay wasn't enough. It was the same pay he'd happily accepted 3 months earlier. Another fisherman stopped coming. Then another. Nobody said, I'm leaving because something lives in the woods. People rarely say what they really fear. They find respectable reasons. Money, family, work, weather. But I knew, because I had begun thinking about leaving too. One evening, I stood at the end of the dock. The sun had dropped behind the mountains. Port Chatham was perfectly still. Joseph stood beside me. "You should go," he said. I looked at him. "You trying to get rid of me?" "No." "Then why?" He watched the water. "Because you're still willing." I didn't understand. He looked at me. "Later, you might not be. Why don't you leave?" Joseph smiled slightly. "This is my home." So? "So you don't leave your home every time you're afraid." Behind us, the forest stretched across the mountains. Dark, endless. I thought about Sam, the body, the footprints, the thing beside the shed. "What does it want?" I asked. Joseph shook his head. "That's the wrong question. What's the right one?" He looked toward Portlock. "Why is it coming closer?" 3 nights later, we got our answer. It was shortly after midnight. Rain. Heavy this time. Most of Portlock was asleep. I woke to the cannery whistle. One blast. Then another. Then another. 3 blasts. The emergency signal. Men jumped from their bunks. Charlie grabbed his rifle. Walter threw open the door. Someone outside was shouting. I ran into the rain. Lanterns were appearing everywhere. People stood in doorways. Harlan was yelling from near the cannery. "Get everyone inside." Then, from the far end of Portlock, came a scream. Human. And immediately after it, something answered from the forest. A sound I have never forgotten. Not a roar, not a howl. Something between them, deep enough that I felt it before I understood I was hearing it. Every dog in Portlock began barking. Then, all at once, they stopped. The entire settlement went silent. Charlie stood beside me. His rifle trembled slightly in his hands. I'd never seen Charlie's hands shake. Across the clearing, something moved between 2 buildings. Large, dark, upright. This time, I saw it. Not clearly, not long, but long enough, and for the first time since arriving in Portlock, I stopped asking whether Nantiinaq was real. The only question left was what we were going to do now that it had come into town. The spaces between the facts. Portlock. Chapter 5. The night it came to Portlock. There are moments when fear changes. At first, fear is something outside of you. A sound, a shadow, a story told beside a stove, Something you can question, something you can explain, something you can laugh about when the sun comes up. But eventually, fear crosses a line, and once it does, you don't ask whether it's real anymore. You only ask how close it is. That night, it was inside Portlock. I stood barefoot in the mud outside the bunkhouse. Rain soaked through my shirt. Men were shouting. Lanterns moved between buildings. Somewhere near the cannery, Harlan was ordering everyone inside. Then everything stopped, because we heard it. A footstep, heavy, slow, somewhere beyond the storage shed. Then another. Charlie stood beside me, rifle against his shoulder. Walter was behind us. "Where is it?" he whispered. Charlie shook his head. Something moved between two buildings. For less than a second, I saw it. A silhouette, tall, broad, upright, then gone. Frank came running toward us. "You see that?" Charlie raised one hand. "Quiet." But quiet. We listened. Rain hammered the roofs. Water poured from gutters. Wind moved through the trees. Then, from behind the cannery, came 3 knocks. Knock. 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 Every man standing there knew that sound. Walter whispered, "Jesus." Charlie looked toward the bunkhouse. Everybody inside. Nobody argued. We gathered in the cannery, maybe 30 people. Men, women, children, people who'd spent months pretending nothing was wrong. Now, nobody pretended. The doors were barred. Lanterns were turned low. Men stood near windows with rifles. Parents held children close. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Harlan moved from one window to another. "This is ridiculous." Charlie looked at him. "You saw it." "I saw somebody." "Who?" "I don't know. 7-foot man wandering around Portlock at midnight?" "Could be." Charlie almost laughed. "Could be what?" Harlan turned away. Joseph arrived through the rear door. 2 men nearly shot him. "Easy." Charlie lowered their rifles. Joseph was soaked. "Where were you?" "My boat." "You see it?" Joseph nodded. That silenced the room. "What did you see?" I asked. He looked at me. "Enough." "Is it Nantiinaq?" Joseph removed his wet coat. "I told you before, a name doesn't explain anything." "I know." "Then tell us what we're dealing with." Joseph looked around the cannery. "Something that isn't afraid of us anymore." That was worse than any answer he could have given. A child began crying. His mother covered him with a blanket. The boy couldn't have been more than 6. He kept asking, "What's outside?" Nobody answered. Around 1 a.m, the dogs began barking again. There were 4 of them near the cannery, working dogs, big animals. They barked toward the northern end of town. Then one began whining. Another pulled against its chain. Charlie moved toward the door. Joseph stopped him. "No." "The dogs." "No. We can't leave them." Joseph looked at him. "You open that door, you open it for everything." Charlie stared at him, then stepped back. The barking continued. Suddenly, one chain snapped tight. Metal scraped. The dog yelped. Then silence. Nobody moved. Another dog began barking wildly. Then another. Then something struck the outside wall. Hard. Women screamed. Several rifles swung toward the sound. "Don't shoot," Harlan shouted. Another impact. Boom. Dust fell from the rafters. Then scratching. Slow. Across the exterior boards. From left to right. I watched the wall. The scratching continued, then stopped. A moment later, something touched the window. Not struck it, touched it. A shape passed across the glass. Large, dark, covered in water. Someone gasped. Then it was gone. Walter whispered, "Tom." I looked at him. He pointed toward another window. A face was there. I say face, but that's not exactly right, because I only saw a part of it. Forehead, eyes, a suggestion of a nose, dark hair plastered by rain. The glass distorted everything. But the eyes, I remember the eyes. They weren't glowing. They weren't red. Nothing supernatural. They looked curious. That frightened me more. It was looking inside, at us. I raised my rifle. The face disappeared. Frank fired. The shot shattered the window. Everyone screamed. Cold rain blew inside. "Idiot!" Harlan shouted. Frank worked the bolt. "I had it. You almost killed somebody. It was right there." Joseph ran to the broken window. He looked outside, then immediately stepped back. "Move away." "What?" "Everybody away from the windows." We moved toward the center of the building. Nothing happened. 1 minute. 2. 5. Then from outside we heard Frank's voice. "Charlie." Frank turned white. His lips hadn't moved. Again, from somewhere behind the cannery. "Charlie." The voice was perfect, exactly Frank's voice. A woman began praying. Charlie stared at Frank. Frank stared back. Neither spoke. Outside, the voice came again. "Charlie." Then Walter's voice. "Tom." I felt every hair on my body rise. Walter stood beside me. Outside, something that sounded exactly like him called my name. "Tom." Joseph whispered, "Don't answer." Then came my own voice. "Let me in." I cannot explain what that does to a man. Hearing your own voice coming from somewhere you are not. "Let me in," child screamed. Then laughter. Not human laughter, not exactly. More like something reproducing a sound it had heard. Short, uneven, wrong. Then nothing. We stayed inside. 2 o'clock. 3. 4. The rain weakened. Nobody slept. Nobody opened the doors. Occasionally, We heard movement outside, a footstep, a scrape. Once, something climbed onto the cannery roof. We heard weight moving overhead, slowly, from one end to the other. The roof creaked beneath it. Then, a heavy thump outside. It had jumped down. Near dawn, everything stopped, completely. Joseph looked toward the windows. Wait! Harlan shook his head. Sun's coming. Wait. For what? Birds. We waited. 5 minutes. 10. Then, somewhere beyond Portlock, a bird called. Another answered. Joseph stood. Now. Charlie removed the bar. 4 men raised rifles. The door opened. Cold morning air entered. Portlock looked normal. That was the strange part. Buildings, mud, rain dripping from roofs, mountains behind the mist, nothing waiting outside, nothing standing in the clearing. Then we saw the damage. One of the dogs was gone. Its chain lay broken in the mud. Another refused to leave its shelter. The storage shed door had been torn partly from its hinges. Several barrels had been overturned. Something had dragged one nearly 40 feet. Then we found the footprints. They began near the shoreline. Large, bare, human-shaped, the same kind we'd seen before. They crossed directly between the buildings, past the bunkhouse, past the storage shed, around the cannery, under the windows. Joseph crouched beside one. I stood next to him. How big? He didn't answer. I put my boot beside it. I had done that before. This time, I wished I hadn't. The print was nearly twice the width of my boot. Charlie followed the trail. We followed him. The tracks continued toward the edge of Portlock, toward the trees, then stopped. Not faded, stopped. Walter looked around. Where'd it go? Nobody answered. Joseph looked upward. Slowly, we did too. A branch above us moved, maybe 20 feet high. Nothing was there, but something had been. The bark was freshly damaged. Charlie stepped backward. We're done. Harlan looked at him. What? I'm leaving. That surprised everyone. Charlie had been in Portlock longer than almost anybody. You can't just leave. Watch me. We have a season to finish. Charlie looked at him. You finish it. Harlan laughed. You're quitting because of tracks? Charlie stepped toward him. No. His voice was quiet. I'm quitting because I finally stopped lying to myself about what made them. That sentence spread through Portlock faster than any rumor. By noon, 3 more men had decided to leave. Then a family. Then another. Harlan tried to stop it. He talked about contracts, pay, transportation, jobs. He reminded everyone that nothing had actually attacked a person inside town. That was true, technically. Fear doesn't care about technicalities. A boat was scheduled to arrive in 2 days. Every available seat was spoken for before sunset. I wasn't leaving. Not yet. Walter thought I was crazy. You heard your own voice outside. I know. You saw that thing. I saw something. Tom, I need the money. You need to be alive to spend it. He was right. I knew he was right. But I was 24, stubborn, and perhaps curious. That's difficult to admit. Part of me wanted to know. I had spent months denying what was happening. Now that I could no longer deny it, I wanted an answer. What was Nantiinaq? An animal? A man? Something unknown? Could it really imitate voices? Had it taken Sam? Had it moved the body? Was there one? More than one? Questions are dangerous things. Sometimes, not knowing keeps you alive. Joseph found me that evening. I was repairing a railing near the dock. You're staying. Looks like it. Why? Money. He smiled. No. What? That's what you tell yourself. I stopped working. What do you think? You want to see it. I didn't answer. Joseph looked toward the forest. That's how it gets men. How what gets men? The unknown. He sat on the dock. I sat beside him. For a while, we watched the water. Then I asked, has anyone ever killed one? Joseph remained silent. Joseph, I don't know. Has anyone tried? Yes. What happened? He looked at me. They didn't come back. I should have stopped asking questions. Instead, I asked another. Where does it live? Joseph looked toward the mountains. There's a valley inland. How far? Too far. What's there? Nothing you need. I laughed. You know, for somebody who keeps telling me not to be curious, you say things that make a man curious. Joseph didn't smile. There's an old trail. What trail? Hunters used it. Used to? He nodded. Why'd they stop? Joseph stood. He looked toward Portlock, then toward the mountains. Because of what they found. What did they find? Joseph didn't answer. He walked away. The boat arrived 2 days later. Charlie left. So did Walter. That surprised me most. Walter stood on the dock with his bag. You sure? I nodded. You? He looked toward the forest. Very. We shook hands. He climbed aboard, then turned. Tom. What? If you hear me calling from those woods, he smiled slightly. Don't come looking. I laughed, but only because he did. The boat pulled away. I watched until it disappeared. Portlock felt emptier, not abandoned, not yet, but quieter. That evening, I moved into Charlie's bunk. I don't know why. Maybe because it was closer to the stove. Maybe because I missed him. As I unpacked, I found something beneath his mattress. A small notebook. Charlie's. Most pages contained ordinary things. Supply numbers, names, weather, boat arrivals. Then, near the back, I found a list. Dates, names, some from years before I'd arrived. Next to several, one word, missing. Others, found. Sam Reed's name was near the bottom. Beside it, a question mark. The spaces between the facts. Portlock. Chapter 6. The Last Boat. I never followed Charlie's map. For years, I wondered whether that made me a coward. Now, I think it's probably why I lived long enough to tell this story. I sat on Charlie's bunk that night, holding the photograph in one hand and the map in the other. 5 hunters, a dark figure standing between the trees. 3 men who, according to Charlie, never came home, and a trail disappearing deep into the mountains, ending at a place he'd circled with 2 words written beside it. Do not go. For months, I had wanted answers. That night, I finally understood something. Not every question deserves one. I folded the map, put it back inside the envelope, and the next morning, I found Joseph. He was repairing something on his boat. I handed him the envelope. He opened it, saw the photograph, then the map. For a long time, he said nothing. Finally, he asked, "Where'd you get this?" Charlie left it. Joseph studied the map. "You know where this goes?" No, that wasn't entirely true. I knew enough. "You ever been there?" Joseph looked toward the mountains, then folded the map. "No." "Charlie?" Joseph hesitated. "Once." I looked at the photograph again. "What happened?" Joseph handed it back. "Ask Charlie." "He left." Joseph nodded. "Exactly." I wanted to keep asking. Instead, I looked toward the forest. "What happens now?" Joseph followed my eyes. "You leave." This time, I didn't argue. Over the next several weeks, Portlock began emptying. Not suddenly. There was no announcement, no meeting where everyone agreed the town was finished. People simply left. One family packed their belongings onto a fishing boat, then another. A cannery worker quit. 2 fishermen stopped returning. Another family said they were moving somewhere with a school closer to their relatives. Everyone had a reason. Nobody said Nantiinaq. But after sunset, nobody walked near the forest either. The cannery still operated. The whistle still sounded. Men still worked. But Portlock felt different. Empty buildings appeared between occupied ones. Windows stayed dark. Bunks remained unused. Every departing boat seemed to take a little piece of the settlement with it. Eventually, I bought passage out. The morning I left, Port Chatham was covered in fog. Of course it was. Joseph walked with me to the dock. I carried 1 bag. The same bag I'd carried into Portlock months earlier. Funny how little a man's belongings change, even when the man carrying them does. At the boat, I stopped. "Joseph." He looked at me. What do you think it was? He knew what I meant. For several seconds, he watched the forest. Then he said, "I think there are places in this world where men have convinced themselves they belong." He looked at me. "And sometimes they don't." That was all he gave me. I climbed aboard. The engine started. Someone untied the line, and Portlock slowly moved away from me. I watched the dock disappear, then the cannery, then the houses. The forest remained visible longer than anything else. Just before the fog swallowed the shoreline, I saw something standing near the trees, tall, dark, motionless. Maybe it was a stump, maybe shadow, maybe nothing at all. I didn't point it out. I simply watched until Portlock disappeared. I never went back. And that's where Thomas Mercer's story ends. Because Thomas Mercer never existed. The man whose voice you've been listening to is fictional. So were Sam Reed, Walter Briggs, and several of the events you've heard described. But Portlock was real. On the southern coast of Alaska's Kenai Peninsula, along Port Chatham, there really was a settlement known as Portlock. A cannery operated there. People worked there. Families lived there. And eventually, the community was abandoned. And surrounding that abandoned settlement, stories grew. Stories of people disappearing in the wilderness. Stories claiming bodies were discovered under strange circumstances. Stories of enormous footprints. And stories of a large, hair-covered creature known in modern retellings as Nantiinaq. Separating history from legend is difficult. Some versions of the Portlock story have been repeated so many times that folklore and documented history have become intertwined. And there are much less mysterious explanations for why Portlock declined. Economic changes, the cannery industry, transportation, the movement of people toward communities offering better opportunities. Perhaps that's all that happened. Perhaps Portlock didn't flee from anything. Perhaps people simply moved on. And decades later, the wilderness filled the empty spaces with stories. But stories usually begin somewhere. And that leaves us with an interesting question. Why did tales of something in the forests surrounding Port Chatham become attached to this particular abandoned place? Was Nantiinaq simply folklore? A misidentified bear? Stories that grew larger with every retelling? Or did frightened people once experience something in those mountains that never made its way into the official record? We don't know. And that's precisely where stories like Portlock live. Not entirely in history, not entirely in legend, but somewhere between them. History gives us the facts. Portlock existed. People lived there. And eventually, they left. Legend gives us something else. Whistles in the forest, impossible footprints, missing men, and something large, watching from between the trees. Which parts are true? Nearly 80 years later, there may be no way to know. The buildings have decayed, the people are gone, and the forests surrounding Port Chatham have reclaimed what was once theirs. But somewhere between what can be proven and what people remembered, there remains a story. And sometimes, the most haunting stories aren't found in the facts themselves. They're found in the spaces between them.